All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'll pray for us. Father, thank you for the opportunity to look at your word. One day, the most important decisions we will ever make in this life will become clear that they're about your word, about what your word says, about the promises that your word contains. And I pray today as we look at this together that you'll open our minds to the scriptures. I pray that we will learn more of what you have for us, and we come, Father, not in any way claiming that we have earned or deserve your blessing, but we come united with Jesus. We ask that you would bless us today because of his obedience in our behalf, and that you would bless us today because he has, by his sacrifice, taken our sins away. And we pray that you would bless us today because he has promised that one day we'll be in perfect conformity to your will. And so would you bless us today based on what he has done in our behalf, for it's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right. Well, we're looking today at Jesus and the man born blind. Our text comes from John 9. It's a very powerful text, a very interesting text. As always, please remember to take attendance quiz 11. And we want to start, as is our normal custom, with the question, what did you find interesting, challenging, confusing about this wonderful miracle in John 9? Carlos.
So, in the verse of John, we see that it says that God made the blind man be born blind, right? So that, like, I don't know, he could later reflect on him killing him. But when Jesus did the procedure of killing him, he used, like, he spat on the ground, he used mud to bring back his sight. Was that necessarily, like, I'm pretty sure he could do it without doing
Yeah, I mean, Jesus heals people over distance by just speaking. The centurion's beloved employee, Jesus heals that man over distance. Jesus often heals by just speaking. The little dead boy, he says, "Little boy, I say to you, get up." It would seem that being a greater miracle, it did not require Jesus to spit on the ground and then put mud on the man's eyes. So, Carlos, here's my theory. You tell me what you think of it. What Jesus did was absolutely meaningless. It has no importance for the interpretation of the story whatsoever. It's just a random detail. God needed the ESV Study Bible to be 2 million letters long, and he was just kind of filling it out with fluff. What do you think? Do you think that's a fair interpretation, or perhaps is there another take we could take?
I don't know. The Bible always seemed filled with symbolism, so I thought it might be something, but if it's filler, then
Right, the Bible's filled with symbolism. Do you know, everyone, that the Bible was written in a different language than ours? Do you know that the word dirt for Jewish people is this word Adamah? Did you know that dirt and Adamah are the same word? So this man puts Adamah on, or Jesus puts Adamah on this man's eyes, and when he washes the Adamah off, he can see? I don't know. Could that be a connection in the story? I saw Alyssa's, is it Alyssa? Elena. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm still working. My mind's flawed, massively flawed. Elena.
Where you said the thing about the translation of dirt, I was thinking that maybe it could also be that since the pool was it meant scent, it and words. It's too early for this. But basically, I was thinking that maybe it could also be that what that man specifically needed was to have sort of like it was sort of like a leap of faith, like this random dude that's been doing miracles around just walks up to you, puts mud on your eyes, and is like, go wash it off at this place. Like, go all the way there, walk all the way over there, and wash it off, and then you'll see. And then he just sort of does it. He doesn't ask for clarification or like ask a question or anything. He just goes.
He may have been desperate enough because at the end of the story, he's not fully aware at first who exactly Jesus is. Jesus tells him. All right, what else did you find interesting? Grace?
I thought it was interesting how I think there was a connection between Genesis 3 and John 9 where Eve was spiritually and morally blind to the truth of realizing that she sinned and what she did. But John 9 is also about physical blindness, but it could have been spiritual blindness at the same time.
Yeah, Grace, what a great connection. The idea that these stories may be completely connected in terms of a whole Bible, biblical theology. Grace, that's a great connection. And in the back, in the very back, I saw your hand, but I've forgotten your name. Will you help me with it again?
My name's
Kevin.
Kevin. When it was talking about Hagar and the well, how she couldn't see the well, Ishmael cried out. And I drew a connection between that and when Jesus was walking with the two men on the road, Simon and they're blind to seeing who Jesus is, and he's talking to them about himself throughout the whole Bible. And then it also talks about that Jesus is the well of living water, and they couldn't see the well in front of them until he revealed it.
Kevin, that's a great connection, and it connects to Elena's idea and question. When it says the pool is the one having been sent, we as intelligent readers need to ask the question, is that the man sent to the pool? I mean, he has to go wash in the pool to see, but is the sent one maybe the sent one, Jesus, and the man has to go to Jesus and wash, and when he gets the Adamah off his eyes, suddenly he can see. And of course, Hagar's eyes are opened. God opens her eyes. And so, Kevin, that's a great observation that you're seeing that none of these stories occur without connection to other stories, both past and future stories. Yes, tell me your name. Pablo.
I found it kind of confusing but also interesting the way in which sight can be both good and bad, especially in John, how Jesus heals, therefore we can see. But then at the end he also says that because you are not blind, you are committing sin.
Yeah, I mean, how baffling is that? Jesus says at the very end of 9, if you were blind, you would be without fault, but because you see, your sin remains. And Pablo, I'm glad you connected that, because it seems like Jesus, well, it may go back to the Adam and Eve story, because the serpent promises, if you do this, your eyes will be opened. And they do it and their eyes are opened, which is odd. But when their eyes are open, they can't see God anymore. They can only hear him. And so their eyes are opened, but in terms of seeing the spiritual reality, they're completely blind. And Pablo, I've wondered if Jesus isn't saying, ironically, if you're the kind of person who thinks you can see, it probably means you're blind. And if you're the kind of person who comes to God, blessed are the spiritually bankrupt, people who don't have two spiritual nickels inherently to rub together, but come in helplessness to a God who can raise the dead and open blind eyes. And I wonder if Jesus, as a powerful communicator, isn't creating a sentence that draws us into that whole Bible, biblical theology, perhaps to see that maybe it's not just this guy who has Adam on his eyes. Maybe it's not just this guy who needs to wash in the sent one. That's a great question. Thank you, Pablo. Who else find something? Kennedy.
I think it was interesting that the parents of the blind guy, like when they found out that he could see, that they got taken over with fear by the Pharisees, that they didn't even acknowledge that their son can now see who was
Yeah.
blind.
Yeah, did you pick that up in the story? The leaders say, is this your son whom you say was born blind? Yeah, we've been faking it for 25 years for the quarters. He could always really see, like they're trying to find any way to make it where Jesus didn't. And then the parents, you think, would be so attached to Jesus. It's like, he gave our son sight, but they're afraid. They're so afraid they'll get kicked out of the synagogue. And so they said, look, we don't know. He's old enough. You ask him, he'll talk. That seems really unseemly to me, and I think it seemed unseemly to John, because he even says the reason they said this because they were afraid they would get kicked out. But the funny thing is, when people kick you out, you know who finds you? Jesus, because they kicked this man out and Jesus found him. And Jesus is kind of like that, I think. When the world kicks you out, Jesus often will find you. What else? What did you find interesting? Henry?
Yes.
Henry.
I found it very interesting how it was like the blind man didn't just become no longer physically blind, he also became no longer spiritually blind when he found out that Jesus is the Christ, and he didn't really hold on to anything after that. He was just like, this man has given me sight, this man truly is the Savior coming into the world. So he was willing to give up everything. He was like, I don't care about my seat in the synagogue, I'm going to follow this guy. And how often in life do we end up forgetting that God also calls us to be willing to leave everything and follow him?
Yeah, Henry, that's a great comment. If we have time later, we're going to go through an exercise of what it was like for this man to walk almost a mile to the fountain, and a mile with spit and dirt on his eyes, and he's blind, so he's kind of feeling his way And don't you imagine there were a lot of people who just made fun of him? Said, what's wrong with him? Like, I knew he was blind. I didn't know he was stupid too. You just hear what people would say. But the funny thing is, none of those people could heal the blind man, but Jesus could heal the blind man. And he walked on that pathway, mocked the entire way. And then when he washed in the sent one, the Adamah came off, and he could see. And the world was still ridiculing people, but he was a blind guy from birth who could see. And it's interesting to me at the end of this story, he turns into a pretty good debater, The Pharisees say, well, we know this man isn't from God. He's a sinner. And he says, well, that's strange, Nobody can do these things. Nobody's ever healed a person blind from birth, and he heals me, and you don't know where he's from. And then it says, they say, you are completely born in sin. And they kicked him out. It's like, oh, must have touched a nerve, they couldn't deal with this man's logic, and this man had never had his voice heard before, and suddenly the whole united Pharisaical body who had just studied so much, they were dumbfounded to the point where they kick him out. And when they kick him out, Jesus finds him. So, Henry, that's a great connection with how his life is like our life. Maybe one more. And I'm going to remember today. Lucas.
I was kind of building off what Henry said. I think it's Isaiah 35, but Isaiah prophesies about how the blind will see, the lame will walk, the deaf will hear. And if I believe so, Jesus references that again. He quotes that and says, this is what I'm going to do. And I don't think he's just talking about physically, like make the lame walk and the blind see. I think he's also talking about spiritually, specifically with the blindness part. He's came to open our eyes, as Isaiah says, and make us complete, make us walk again, make us hear, and all that. So I think it's more than just physical; it's a spiritual
Yeah.
thing too.
Yeah, for us to walk in the ways of God, to work the works of God, to think the thoughts of God, he's come to do all of that. And this miracle perhaps gives us a picture of what that is like. So what I want to try to argue for today is that John 9 teaches that we're all born spiritually blind, that this man, in fact, is an acted parable of every person who's the natural offspring of Adam. And you think about this man, he was outside the temple. He couldn't go in. Why could he not go in? Because he was blind. And the law said those who were suffering with all kinds of things couldn't go in. And you say, well, why is that? And you go back to Leviticus, that book that we all skip, and it's named in Hebrew, God calls, hey, come in, be with me, live in my house. And that's great, but the problem is I'm not the kind of person who can live with God because I've got a problem. I've got spiritual death connected with me. I have spiritual blindness. I have spiritual lameness. I have a mind that doesn't want to think about things the same way God thinks. And so God is saying, come, but in effect, we are the beggar. And we're outside of God's temple, and we want to go in and we want to be whole, but we've got this problem. And Jesus is saying, this is how everyone's problem can be fixed. Go find the sent one, wash in the sent one, and when you wash in the sent one, the Adamah will come off your eyes. So I'd like to make the case that John 9 teaches that we're all born spiritually blind and must wash in the sent one. And I hope that one day, by God's grace, I'll be at the place where Jonathan Edwards was. And he used to say, whenever anyone describes their sin to me, this is part of his 70 resolutions, he says, make me the kind of person who can see in their sin my own fallenness. In other words, there are no abnormal, shocking sins out there. They're abominations and everything, but they're normal, natural sins just like we all have. My sin may not be exactly the same as your sin, but both those sins come from the same source, our fallenness in Adam. We are all coming to the cross. The ground at the foot of the cross is completely level, and every person who's saved is saved the exact same way because they're receiving grace from a God who can break the power of canceled sin, who can raise the spiritually dead, who can give sight to the spiritually blind, who can cause the lame to walk in his ways. John 9 teaches we're all born spiritually blind and must wash in the sent one. And the second thing I want to try to make the case for is that in John 9, Jesus teaches that physical suffering, and in fact all challenges, are not to be thought of somehow as direct judgments from God, but rather as opportunities to show God's glory. The disciples had in their mind, okay, this guy was born blind. That must mean he's some kind of horrible sinner, or maybe it was his parents were horrible sinners. And Jesus is saying, hey, don't think of it like that. This man's blindness is an occasion for God to be glorified. And if that's true, that means that God can come to the darkness that is in our lives, perhaps the darkness that other people have inflicted on us, and by his light can make even those areas of darkness trophies of grace. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. This guy could say, hey, I know a guy who can fix blindness from birth. I know a guy who, he's not like the other people who say those wicked things. He knows how to make a difference. Jesus teaches that physical suffering and all challenges are not to be thought of as direct judgment, but rather as an opportunity to show God's glory. So that's what I want to try to do this morning. One of the things that will help us with this story, if we can develop what's called a sanctified imagination. Often we miss the full power in Jesus' stories because we read them too quickly. What we need is a sanctified imagination. What we need is to wrestle with the story to the point where we can see ourselves in the story, where we can feel it, hear it, smell it, taste it. And so that's what I want us to try to do this morning, to try to get in this story, to try to develop a sanctified imagination about the details. And where we need to start is we need to feel what this man's life was like as someone who had been born blind. We know that this is a grown man. His parents tell the Pharisees he's a grown man, he'll talk for himself. So this guy had been blind a long time. He survived in the world by sitting by the doorway to the temple, and that's how he got the meager amount of small change that he needed to give him the things to survive every day. What was that guy's life like? All day long he sits in the main doorway to the temple. Other people go in and worship God. He can't because he's got this deformity that excludes him from going into the presence of God. He sits at the door all day begging for money, and you're the guy. Tell me what your life would be like. Yeah, it's can you feel the shame that you would feel? Everybody else can go in, but I'm on the outside. How, Kevin?
Feel almost like resentful, I guess, like, why would God give me this element? And even if he give me this element, why would he exclude me from being able to be in this?
Yeah, everybody gets, why me? Why me? How would you beg for money? You're the guy. Whether you eat tonight depends on how much money you get. How would you beg? You're sitting at the main door of the mega church of the day, and whether you eat tonight depends on the amount of money people give you as they go in to worship God. How would you beg? Would you have a cup or something? What would you say? Oh God, be merciful to me, this sinner. Oh God, bless these people as they go in to worship you today. Oh God, I'm unclean. I wish I could go in, but I can't go in because I'm blind. These people can see and can go in. I'm blind and can't see. Do you imagine anybody ever stole the money out of your cup? Do you imagine the pastor's kids ever kicked it over and laughed at you? Do you imagine you ever had something on your clothes that you couldn't see, that other people could see, and they laughed at you about it? And what do your clothes look like? Are they like nice clothes, or are they not nice clothes? And who else is there with you at the door? That's what this man's life was like. This is a picture of the temple. As I'm understanding this story, the guy was probably here. This is what that would look like, the main gate. If he was at one of the other gates, this is a little down from that, but you are up against the wall. You can't go in to see the beauty of the temple because you can't see anything. You're blind. It's almost, is it not, like you were at the gate of heaven, but you're just 5 feet on the wrong side. That's what his life was like. And the point I want to make is that the Bible teaches that we're all spiritually blind. We're all, from the moment we're conceived, excluded from the pleasure of living with God. our first parents, and in particular our first forefather Adam, gambled away our estate, stripped us of the title that God had given us, and lost it, and we were evicted. The spiritual sheriffs of the cherubs came in and threw out our stuff on the curb. And rightly so, because our parents were wicked people. They introduced into God's garden death and misery and oppression and selfishness and spiritual blindness. And we're excluded. We've lost it all, but the Bible is saying spiritual blindness is much worse than physical blindness. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Christ is the new Adam. He can get us back. He can buy back our estate. He can re-give us the titles that we had at birth. But the story is not about us, it's about Him and His greatness. Jesus says to the Pharisees who thought they were better than other people, the Pharisees who said, "You were completely born in sin." You know, if you say something like that, you were completely born in sin, you know what the other part of that you don't say is? And I wasn't. You're completely born in sin, and I am inherently better than you. God afflicted you because you're bad, and God didn't afflict me because I'm good. And that's wicked. And that's kind of a thought a lot of us share, isn't it? So-and-so's bad, and I'm a little bad, but you definitely have to get the Hubble telescope to magnify my sin so that you can see it. Or, no, you've got to get an electron microscope, because my sin's there, but it's really small. And it's really not. In fact, a lot of times I don't even think it exists there anymore because, yeah, I've got it. It's little. And the truth is, my sin is Alpha Centauri, and it would be bigger than our universe. And I don't recognize that because I'm spiritually blind and can't see the things God sees. Jesus in the end says, if you are blind, if you ever got to the place where blessed are the spiritually bankrupt, then you would be the kind of people who can go in the real temple. But when you say, we see, your guilt remains. So imagine at that gate that Jesus is going in with his disciples. The blind man is there, and his disciples ask the question, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" How many times do you think the man had heard that question? In other words, to kind of spell that out, the disciples are saying, this guy who's excluded from our megachurch is obviously inherently a lot worse than we are. Lord, why is he inherently a lot worse than we are? And can you hear in that they're saying, hey, we're inherently better? That guy is bad, and yes, Jesus, we have sin, but it's really little sin. But it's not like that guy whose sin is bad. don't you just half expect Jesus to say, that's stupid, you know? But he doesn't. He doesn't say that unless people need it. Sometimes he says stuff like that, but he doesn't say that to them. But this question is wicked. And this question is the exact same position that the Pharisees are speaking about at the end. You were born in sin. Jesus is trying to help his disciples see that's the wrong way to look at this. But if you're the man and you've been there a long time, say you're 25 years old, you've been hearing that statement your entire life, does that statement hurt your feelings? You're sitting there and people are talking about how bad you are, that you have somehow sinned in the womb and it was so bad that God struck you with blindness, or maybe your parents were just scummy people. Does that hurt your feelings to hear? And remember, this is religious people who are saying this. Going into the megachurch, maybe you can hear the PA, maybe you can hear the worship band. Who sinned, this man or his parents that he was born blind? And isn't it callous of the disciples to say something like that? They want to get their theology right and have no idea that they're crushing this man's soul. When we look at blindness, the Bible is teaching that we're all blind. And if any of our eyes are open, it's open. Our eyes are open because of the mercy of God. We're all outside the gate of heaven wanting to go in because all of us are plagued with spiritual blindness. But the truth of this story is God can open the eyes of the blind. God can open our eyes. God can make us see. Think about all the things you can't do if you are blind. You ever have a bump or something on your face, you know, and you're trying to deal with it, and what do? You go to a mirror, and I've got a mirror at my house, or I guess my wife has it, I use it, but it'll magnify, you know, and you kind of figure out what's wrong with you. Could you do that if you were blind? If you cut your own hair and you look in the mirror and realize, oh, I missed this space, and you're blind, could you do that? Or if you had your shirt on backwards? Or if you had two shoes on and they didn't match in color, could you see that? This man's suffering was great. And our suffering with spiritual blindness is great. What's going on here is Jesus is correcting a wrong idea. And part of the idea is that most people are basically good. And yeah, I need to be forgiven a little bit, but I'll be forgiven a little bit and then God will take me to heaven because I'm really not that bad. And Jesus is saying, maybe that's not true. Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or that his parents sinned, but that the works of God might be displayed in him for God's glory. This man's challenge is for God's glory. And you say, well, if you only knew the kind of challenges that I face in life, if you only knew the kind of struggles that I had, if you only knew my background or my parents' background, or if you only knew, I wish I knew. I wish in compassion I could hear and weep tears with you. But I know this, that Jesus knows, and Jesus weeps tears, and Jesus says, this can be for God's glory. Don't think of it as oh, God struck me down. Think of this as God can use this for His glory. We must work the works of Him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. In the world there is the word cosmos. Having said these things, he spat upon the ground and made mud with the saliva. He anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool at Siloam, which means the one having been sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Now I want you to imagine what that journey is like. So imagine that in this room, we are at the doorway to the temple. It's beautiful. We have seen some stones that made up that entryway, and the stones are 26 feet long. So imagine a carved stone rectangle, 26 feet long, massive, beautiful. Imagine that's this place. We're standing right at the door. Jesus makes mud, smears adamah all over this man's eyes. Maybe some of the spit even comes down with the mud. Can you imagine what that looked like? And can you imagine what you felt like when you hear these hopeful words of Jesus, and then you hear him spit on the ground? And then you feel slimy mud on the place where your eyes are. It would be very tempting to think, oh, there it is. They're making fun of me again. Just like all the other people, they're making fun of me. They're talking about how bad I am or how bad my parents are. But Jesus tells him to go wash. Imagine that journey. Well, to imagine that journey, we need to kind of realize how far Jesus was telling the man to walk. And this is the journey. So remember that picture, that big stairway. And then the pool at Siloam is all the way down at the bottom. It's a little less distance from right here to the red light at the entryway to Bryan College. But the difference is we're in a downtown city. And it's the rush of the day. Imagine you're the man and you've got spit and mud on your eyes and you're trying to walk to the entryway at Bryan College to wash in a pool that's by that entryway. And imagine classes are changing and you've got mud and spit on your eyes and you're trying to walk from here to the entryway. How easy would that be to walk? Do you imagine people would run into you and say anything? Do you imagine someone to have a unguarded moment where they said, "What's wrong with him? You're struggling to obey Jesus, and you seem to be in everyone else's way." And this journey is a long journey. In fact, this isn't the right side of the mountain, but it's the other side of the mountain. That's how steep it was. I think in that picture, yeah, right under. Right here, that's a person. How hard would it get? How hard would it be to get to that pool? This is the actual pool. This is the pool at Siloam. And you know, the pool at Siloam is fed by the Gihon Spring. We ever heard the Gihon before? Oh yeah, we have. That's one of the 4 rivers of Eden. Huh. Why did Jesus make the man go? Where else in the Bible does it talk about mud, dirt, or clay? The creation of man. This man has Adam on his eyes. To dust you are, to dust you will return. Where else in the Bible does it talk about spit? If we went to Jewish sources, they would talk sometimes about the curative power of spit. That kind of misses most spit passages. Is spit a good thing or a bad thing? Miriam, when she's healed from leprosy, God says to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, would not she be unclean for a week? And doesn't the New Testament say that Jesus was spat upon? This man has Adam and shame signifying his blindness, but when he washes in the sent one, he can see. Go wash in the one having been sent. Is this the man who's sent to the pool, or is this the one, go wash in the one having been sent? I think it's go wash in Jesus. Jesus is the new Adam, can take away our shame. Jesus is the new Adam, can take away our blindness. And the world will mock. But you know what? I don't think anybody was mocking that man on the way back. Because he could see. He could see because Jesus had opened his eyes. You know, the world mocks at Christianity. But I can tell you this, if I were an orphan, I would be glad about the orphanages. And if I were in a single mom family, I would be glad for all the shelters that churches have. And if I was hungry as a drunkard, I would be glad for the soup kitchens. And if I were in some foreign city and didn't know a soul, the first thing I would do is start looking for churches, because that's what Christians do. They help people. Well, that's what good churches do. Because they're following a good king, a king who can open the eyes of the blind. That's what I have for you today. I hope you have a good rest of the day. I will see you on Wednesday.